Sir, you need to back your scooter away from the pharmacy counter. Stop yelling at staff and customers.
I'm a Navy veteran. Look at my This is how you treat a disabled man?
Lower your voice.
You're all against me. I'm not going anywhere.
Please just spit on me.
All right, quick pre-story talk before we jump in. This was one of those situations that sounded almost ridiculous, until it became obvious how dangerous ridiculous gets when it's backed by entitlement, happening in public, and the only people who can shut it down are forced to document every move. And the scariest part? One tiny escalation turned this from a simple removal into a case that ended with cuffs, charges, and a hospital stop before jail would even accept him. When officers reached the pharmacy area inside the Target in Clark County, Georgia, Hank Blair Wittenberg was already in full display mode on his mobility scooter. Officer Marcus Young immediately tried to control the scene and get Hank identified and removed. Hank refused to cooperate and kept escalating in front of shoppers. Officer Elena Ramirez positioned herself close enough to intervene because Hank's behavior wasn't just loud. It was volatile, racial, and aimed at staff and customers who couldn't just walk away. Tell me where you're watching from, city, state, or country. And if you like stories where hateful behavior meets real consequences through cameras, procedure, and accountability, hit like and subscribe. These are the kind of moments that only change when people stop letting them slide. Now, rewind. Earlier, the pharmacy team had been trying to keep the day normal. Tanya Brooks was behind the counter doing what pharmacy staff always did, moving fast, answering questions, trying to keep the line from backing up. That routine broke when Hank parked himself near the pharmacy and started going after people. It wasn't a complaint about service. It wasn't confusion. It was harassment, loud, repeated, and racially abusive. Customers reacted the way people often did in stores. They avoided eye contact and tried to move past it like it wasn't happening. But the noise followed them. A few shoppers slowed down to watch. Others sped up. Jamal Price was one of the people who couldn't just tune it out because he had kids with him. And now he had to manage a family moment while an adult man was yelling hateful things a few aisles away. At first, the store tried to handle it in-house. Derek Holloway, the on-duty manager, came over to assess and contain it. He wasn't looking for drama. He was looking for an exit route, get Hank away from the pharmacy, stop the disruption, and prevent the situation from spreading into the rest of the store. But Hank didn't take any off-ramp. He stayed combative. He stayed loud. He stayed racial. And every time staff tried to set a boundary, he responded by escalating again, like the attention was the point. That's what made it dangerous. It wasn't just rude. It was unstable behavior in a crowded public space, where nobody knew what he'd do next. So Derek made the call that turns a retail problem into a legal one. Police were contacted. When Officer Marcus Young and Officer Elena Ramirez arrived, Hank tried to take control of the interaction immediately. He attempted to redirect the focus away from what he'd been doing and toward himself, specifically a severe toe-foot injury and his Navy veteran status. Like those facts should override the reason officers were there. The officers didn't ignore the injury, but they didn't let it become a shield either. Officer Young kept the purpose clear. Hank's behavior near the pharmacy had created a disturbance and targeted people in a way the store couldn't manage safely. Hank's response was to double down. He refused to cooperate. He stayed combative. He continued escalating while shoppers watched, some frozen, some whispering, some trying to pretend it wasn't happening. And in moments like this, the crowd matters. Because every extra second the behavior continues, more people get pulled in, and the store becomes less safe. By the end of this phase, the situation had shifted. It stopped being about simply removing Hank from the store. It became about whether officers could end the disturbance without Hank forcing it into something worse, right there in front of staff, families, and cameras. And Hank looked like he was about to test that limit. Hank Blair Wittenberg kept pushing like the officers were there to negotiate with him instead of stop him. Officer Marcus Young stayed focused on clearing the pharmacy area and restoring order. He kept the instructions simple and procedural. Move away from the counter, stop yelling at staff and customers, and cooperate so this could end without anyone getting hurt or dragged into it. Officer Elena Ramirez held her position close enough to step in, but not so close she'd create a new excuse for Hank to claim he was being crowded. She watched his hands, his face, and the way he kept turning his scooter slightly to keep an audience. Hank used every second to perform. He kept redirecting back to his toe-foot injury and his Navy veteran status, like those 2 points should erase what everyone had just witnessed. But the louder he got, the less that redirect worked. Shoppers weren't reacting like this was a misunderstanding. They were reacting like this was a grown man choosing to terrorize a public space. Tanya Brooks stayed behind the counter, trying to keep her hands steady as she did her job. Derek Holloway hovered nearby, ready to issue the store's next step if police needed it documented. Jamal Price stayed with his kids, now fully locked into protective parent mode, scanning for a clean path out. Officer Young attempted one last off-ramp: cooperate, get out of the store, and let this end as a removal instead of an arrest. Hank refused, and not in a quiet way. He escalated louder, angrier, and more racially abusive, still using slurs and insults aimed at staff and bystanders, like he wanted someone to react so he could turn the narrative. That was when the situation tipped. In the middle of the confrontation, Hank spit into Officer Elena Ramirez's face. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a stray droplet in the chaos. It was a deliberate act that crossed a line every officer understood. The moment that turned the call from disturbance into battery. The change in the officers was immediate. The conversation ended. The control phase began. Officer Young moved in with Officer Ramirez, and they placed Hank in handcuffs. The officers didn't debate it because there was nothing left to debate. The spit made the decision for everyone. It also made the paperwork clear. That one action gave officers what they needed to justify custody without needing to stretch the original call into something it wasn't. Hank reacted the way people often did when they realized they'd overplayed their hand. He got louder. He kept shouting insults and racial abuse, only now it wasn't directed at helpless staff. It was aimed at the officers and anyone nearby who looked like they might be listening. The pharmacy area felt tense and exposed, like the whole store had been forced into the moment. Because Hank had already shown he'd spit once, Officer Young and Officer Ramirez applied a spit hood to prevent it from happening again. It was a safety measure, not drama. It was the officers acknowledging reality. The man had already crossed a bodily boundary, and they weren't going to let him do it twice. While police handled custody, Derek Holloway handled Target's side of the consequences. He formally barred Hank from the store for roughly 2 years. Not as a symbolic punishment, an actual trespass barman action that meant Hank could be arrested if he returned. It was the store drawing a line in ink, not just in conversation. Hank didn't calm down once he was secured. During transport, he continued a long stream of insults and racist comments. Officer Young documented it, while keeping the drive controlled and the situation contained. Officer Ramirez stayed alert, absorbing what had already happened, and making sure the process stayed clean. There was no room for shortcuts now. Everything had to be done by the book, because a case like this always tried to twist itself into a complaint later. At one point in the transport, Officer Young referenced what the store already knew. Hank wasn't a one-time surprise. He had been a repeat call at that Target. Staff had dealt with him before. The difference this time was that the behavior had escalated in front of more witnesses in a tighter space, and then crossed into a clear criminal act. By the time they reached booking, the incident had already turned into a folder: disturbance, racial harassment, a public audience, the spit, the restraint, the hood, and the official barment. Every step had a reason attached to it. And that's where Hank ran into the consequence he wasn't expecting. Because even though officers were ready to book him on disorderly conduct and battery, the process didn't go straight into a cell. His foot wound, The same thing he tried to use as a shield earlier suddenly mattered in a way that didn't help him at all. Intake took one look and refused to accept him without medical clearance, which meant the next stop wasn't a jail pod. It was a hospital. The moment they got to intake, the plan was straightforward. Book Hank Blair Wittenberg on disorderly conduct and battery for spitting on Officer Elena Ramirez, then let the jail handle him from there. But the jail didn't take him. Not yet. The intake staff saw the foot situation up close, whatever Hank had been pointing to earlier as a severe toe-foot injury. And they did what jails often did when someone arrived with a visible medical issue. They refused acceptance until he was medically cleared. It wasn't about sympathy. It was liability. If they took him in and something went wrong, it became their problem. So instead of Hank disappearing into a holding cell like he'd probably assumed would happen to other people, the process hit a hard stop. Officer Marcus Young had to pivot. The paperwork didn't end. The custody didn't end. It just moved locations. They transported Hank to a hospital. And here's what's important about that hospital detour. Hospitals create documentation outside police control. Timestamps, notes, observations, a separate chain of records that can't be rewritten later to make a story cleaner. At the hospital, Hank tried to reclaim the narrative again. Injury first, veteran status next, outrage on top. But it didn't work the way he wanted because the setting changed the rules. In Target, he'd been able to use volume and public pressure. In a hospital, nobody cared how loud he was. They cared about vitals, clearance, and whether he was fit to be held. Nurse Kelsey Nguyen handled the intake like she'd seen every version of this before. A patient in custody who wanted the whole room to revolve around them. She focused on the foot, assessed what needed to be assessed, and documented what needed to be documented. Meanwhile, Officer Young kept everything procedural. He maintained custody, tracked times, and ensured the chain stayed intact. Officer Ramirez, after being the target of the spit, stayed locked into the same thing she'd been doing from the start, keeping the case clean. No shortcuts, no extra friction, just documentation. Once medical clearance was obtained, they went back to complete what had been delayed. The jail accepted Hank after clearance, and that's when the charges became real, in the way people like Hank rarely expected them to. Not as a lecture, not as a scolding, but as a recorded, processed, official consequence. Disorderly conduct for the disturbance. Battery for spitting on a police officer. The spit hood, the trespass barment, the body-worn cameras, the store witnesses, the pharmacy staff, the transport documentation, the hospital clearance records, all of it formed a neat chain. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just tight. And that's the part that matters. Because in a lot of incidents like this, the person causing harm tries to rewrite the story afterward. They claim they were provoked. They claim they were targeted. They claim the public only saw a clip. But this wasn't a clip situation. This was a full sequence with multiple cameras, multiple witnesses, and multiple institutions logging the same reality. Target did its part through Derek Holloway's formal barment. The store drew a bright line. Hank wasn't welcome back for roughly 2 years, and returning could lead to another arrest. Tanya Brooks and the pharmacy staff had what they needed too, an official record that what happened to them wasn't just part of the job. And for the community, it served as a clear example of how accountability actually works when it's done right. Not through screaming matches, not through viral fantasies, through procedure. So here's the question for you. If you were in that Target, maybe with your kids like Jamal Price, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up, filmed, walked away, grabbed a manager? And if you were the employee behind that pharmacy counter, how safe would you feel if nobody intervened? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that public racism isn't free speech when it becomes harassment and assault. And make sure you subscribe for more story times where the truth gets documented and consequences actually land.
What's up, my man? You've been here a minute. Go ahead, show me your ID.
I hear you, officer. I'm not providing ID. There is no reason for that. We got a call. You've been sitting here too long.
Sitting in a diner isn't illegal. If you want me to leave, I'll leave.
No, you're not leaving until we know who you are.
I'm standing up and walking out.
Cuff him. Got it.
All right, quick pre-story talk before we jump in. Now, this was one of those situations that started off sounding almost ridiculous until it became clear how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't been in place, this would have ended a very different way. So picture this. Antonio Smith sat alone in a booth at a neighborhood diner that looked like it came straight out of a postcard. Clean windows, soft chatter, silverware clinking. The kind of place where people acted like nothing bad ever happened, because nothing bad ever happened to them. And yet 2 uniformed officers stood over him like he'd tripped an alarm. Officer Ryan Keller took the lead. Officer Johnny Briggs hovered just half a step behind, angled like he was ready to move, if Antonio so much as blinked wrong. Keller started with that practiced, casual energy. He talked to Antonio like they were already cool, like this was going to be quick, light, friendly. But the friendliness didn't last long. His voice shifted into something tighter, more official, more ownership. He told Antonio they'd gotten a call. Someone said Antonio had been sitting there, just hanging out for over an hour. Keller corrected himself and said closer to 90 minutes. Then he framed it like it wasn't really a question anymore. He said they couldn't be having that in this community. And right after that, Keller did what officers always did when they wanted the moment to tilt in their favor. He demanded ID, not asked, demanded. He told Antonio to hand it over slowly, specifically to Briggs. He layered it with the usual warning about no quick movements. Like a man sitting in a booth deciding between breakfast and lunch had suddenly become a threat that needed careful handling. Antonio didn't raise his voice. He didn't puff his chest. He didn't perform anger for them to justify anything with. He stayed calm and polite and said he wasn't going to pull out his ID. And that one sentence changed everything. Keller treated the refusal like it automatically created a bigger issue, like declining to help them build a case was the same as committing a crime. He started talking about how this could turn into something else, how it could turn into charges, how they were going to identify Antonio one way or another. Briggs stayed quiet, but he leaned in just a little more, like Keller was winding up the words and Briggs was the tool that would finish the job. Antonio didn't argue the law in big speeches. He didn't insult them. He repeated himself calmly. He understood what Keller was saying. He was still not handing over ID. That was the moment where the whole diner felt like it held its breath. You know that feeling when normal life is still happening around you, but the air at your table is different? People kept eating. A server kept walking plates to tables. But a few heads turned and a few eyes lingered too long, like they were trying to figure out what Antonio had done to deserve this. Now, before we go further, drop where you're watching from. City, state, country, whatever. And if you like stories where people stay calm, under pressure, and still win through accountability, hit like and subscribe. Because this one is exactly about that. Staying steady while someone tries to bait you into being the problem. All right, back to it. To understand why this hit so hard, you have to rewind about an hour and a half. Antonio had walked into that diner like any other customer. No scene, no attitude. He'd picked a booth where he could see the door, the counter, and most of the room without turning his head too much. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was just intentional. He'd been calm, polite with staff, the type who said thank you like he meant it. And the thing is, diners like that loved calm customers. The regulars treated it like their living room. People sat longer than they ate. Folks camped out with coffee, refills, and laptops. Nobody called the police on that. But Antonio's black in a diner where community comfort was treated like a private club. At first, it was subtle. A long look from a man at the counter, a server hesitating a second longer than necessary, a woman glancing over and then quickly back to her phone, like she didn't want to be caught watching. Antonio didn't react. He didn't offer anyone a reason to escalate. He just sat, thinking, and flipping through food options like it was the most normal thing in the world. And in a way, that was the point. When Keller said he'd been there 90 minutes, Antonio didn't deny it. He didn't scramble to explain. He didn't start bargaining to make them comfortable. He just stayed calm and let the facts sit there. Keller kept building the story anyway. He claimed people were getting irritated. He implied Antonio wasn't ordering. He implied Antonio was there to bother people. Then he tried to end it with a simple command. Antonio needed to leave. But Antonio didn't move. He didn't stiffen up either. That's what made it so unsettling for them. He kept his tone even. He made it clear he heard Keller. He made it clear he understood the demand. And then, almost like he was speaking around them instead of to them, Antonio started talking about food. Not as a joke, not as sarcasm loud enough for the diner to laugh, just casually. Like he was deciding what sounded good. Avocado toast, beef stroganoff, grilled salmon. Things that had nothing to do with two officers looming over a booth. And you could feel Keller's patience thinning. He wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. He wasn't getting fear. He wasn't getting anger. He wasn't getting compliance. So Keller tightened the leash with words. He warned Antonio again that they were going to identify him one way or another. He brought up taking him downtown. He framed it like Antonio was choosing the hard way, like Antonio was the one escalating by not cooperating. Antonio didn't flinch. He stayed composed and repeated calmly that he wasn't handing over his ID. At that point, Briggs shifted his weight, not dramatically, just enough to signal he was ready for the next step. Keller watched Antonio for a beat, eyes hard now, the casual mask fully gone. And then Keller made the decision that turned a ridiculous situation into a dangerous one. He stopped trying to persuade. He switched to command, and Briggs moved closer, like he'd been waiting for that exact signal the whole time. Briggs stepped in tighter, and the space around Antonio's booth shrank fast. Keller's voice stayed controlled, but the message got uglier. He kept framing it like Antonio was the one creating a problem, like refusing to participate in their little script automatically meant guilt. Keller repeated that it was simple right now, just a guy hanging around too long. But if Antonio kept refusing, Keller implied they could turn it into something bigger, not because of anything Antonio had done, because they had the power to make it bigger. This was the chess move. Create a vague community complaint, turn it into suspicion, turn suspicion into demands, turn refusal into defiance, turn defiance into an excuse. Briggs stayed positioned like the consequence. He didn't have to say much. His silence did the job. It signaled that if Keller decided the conversation was over, Briggs was the part that would make it physical. Antonio didn't give them the satisfaction of panic. He didn't start pleading his innocence. He didn't reach for his wallet just to make it stop. He sat there like a man who knew exactly what their pressure was trying to pull out of him. And then he did something that made Keller visibly more irritated. Antonio stayed calm and focused on food like the conversation wasn't even about him being forced out of a diner. He looked at the menu like he was still choosing between breakfast and lunch, like he'd just remembered something sounded good. He named options in that easy, almost absent way: avocado toast, beef stroganoff, grilled salmon, like he was narrating his own thought process. To Keller, it felt like disrespect, but it wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. It was worse than that. It was Antonio refusing to be emotionally controlled. Keller leaned harder into the narrative. He claimed Antonio was pissing off the people. He claimed Antonio wasn't ordering. He claimed Antonio needed to scoot on down the road. He talked like he owned the space, like his job wasn't to enforce laws, but to enforce comfort. Antonio's response stayed the same. Calm, polite, short. He understood. He still wasn't giving them his ID. Keller's eyes narrowed like he was running out of socially acceptable ways to keep pushing. He circled back to the threat again. Identification was happening either way. If Antonio wouldn't cooperate, They'd do it for him. Keller implied cuffs. Keller implied downtown. Keller implied time, humiliation, paperwork, inconvenience, punishment for not submitting. Antonio didn't rise to it, and because Antonio didn't rise to it, Keller had to decide whether to walk away empty-handed or prove he could win. That's when Keller snapped. His tone changed in a way that didn't need translation. He stopped acting like this was optional. He directed Briggs to cuff him. Antonio's body moved before his face did. He slid out of the booth, not in a sudden way, but like someone trying to remove the excuse. He stood up, angled his shoulders away from them, and signaled he was leaving. His whole posture said, "Fine. You want me gone? I'm gone. No fight. No scene?" It should have ended right there. But Keller and Briggs weren't looking for an ending. They were looking for control. Briggs reached for Antonio anyway. It happened fast, but not chaotic. Briggs grabbed him and pinned the moment in place. Antonio didn't swing. Antonio didn't lunge. He didn't give them the resisting clip they loved to write later. His hands stayed visible, his face stayed calm. But Briggs held him like the decision had already been made. And immediately, almost automatically, Briggs started searching. Not a careful pat-down for safety. Not a clear explanation. Just hands moving to pockets with a purpose. Briggs checked one side, then the other, then went straight to a front pocket like he already knew where to look. And there it was. Briggs pulled out Antonio's ID. Keller's entire energy shifted the second the card was in view. He stopped talking like Antonio was an anonymous nuisance and started talking like Antonio was now a known quantity. Keller watched Briggs confirm the name, watched the little administrative victory land, and you could feel the satisfaction in the way Keller's shoulders settled. They got what they wanted. They proved they could. But that victory only lasted a breath. Because Antonio's expression changed, not into fear, not into anger, but into something colder. Like a person watching someone else step onto a trap they didn't even see. Antonio looked at Keller and Briggs the way you look at someone who just bragged about breaking something, not realizing it was expensive and very well documented. Antonio didn't have to raise his voice to flip the dynamic. He just let a few words land with precision. He implied he wasn't there as some random guy hanging out. He implied he was federal. He implied he was working something that required anonymity. And forcing him to identify himself, forcing him to be exposed in a public place, had just ruined an operation that wasn't theirs to touch. Then Antonio added the detail that made Keller's jaw tighten in a way he couldn't hide. The whole encounter was recorded, not a maybe, not a threat, a statement. And when Antonio said that, Keller's face did something officers hated doing in public. It hesitated, just a flicker. But it was there. The calculation started, the mental rewind, the question that always came too late. Who else is going to see this? Briggs's grip loosened slightly, not out of kindness, but out of uncertainty. Keller didn't step back, but his authority suddenly felt less solid, like it was balancing on paperwork instead of ego. Antonio didn't press them with insults. He didn't gloat. He did something more effective. He started asking for documentation. He demanded their identifying information, names, badge numbers, whatever official ID system their department used. He asked how to obtain the incident report. He asked how to request the Bodycam footage. He asked it like a checklist, like he'd done this before, like he knew exactly what gets ignored and what can't be ignored once it's in writing. And for the first time since they walked up to his booth, Keller and Briggs weren't steering the moment anymore. They were reacting to it. Keller and Briggs didn't suddenly become nicer. They became careful. That was the difference. A minute earlier, Keller had been comfortable talking like the diner belonged to him, like community peace was a law he could enforce on command. Now, with Antonio calmly asking for identifiers and paperwork, Keller's posture shifted into damage control. Briggs, who had been all hands and pressure, started moving like every motion might be replayed later. Antonio didn't chase an apology. He didn't bargain. He stayed focused on the part officers hated most, the official trail. He repeated his requests, steady and precise. Their names, their badge numbers or department IDs, the process for getting the incident report, the correct way to request body cam footage, the contact information for the supervisor on duty, the details that turned a he said, she said into a case file. Keller tried to reframe the moment as routine. He tried to make it sound like this was normal community policing. But Antonio didn't accept the reframe. He kept the spotlight on the sequence: a call about a man sitting too long, a demand for ID without any clear crime, a threat of forced identification, then physical grabbing and a pocket search to get what they wanted. And the whole time, Antonio kept his voice even. No theater, no shouting, no "you're racist" speech to give them something to dismiss. Just the facts of what happened. That restraint mattered. Because in these situations, officers often survive not by being right, but by getting the other person to look unstable. Antonio didn't give them that. He asked one more thing that sealed it. He made it clear this wasn't going to stay in the diner. He indicated he had the encounter recorded. He implied his work required discretion. He implied their forced identification had interfered with something bigger than their shift schedule. He didn't need to over-explain. The uncertainty did the work for him. Keller couldn't tell if Antonio was bluffing, and that ambiguity made every decision Keller had made feel riskier. The officers eventually separated from him, not because they suddenly respected his rights, but because they could sense the ground changing under their feet. Keller and Briggs moved away with the tight, irritated energy of people who realized they'd pushed too far and now had to pretend they hadn't. Antonio didn't linger to trade words. He did what people who understand accountability do. He secured the details, left, and immediately started building the paper trail while everything was fresh. Over the next day, Antonio filed formal complaints through the channels that couldn't be shrugged off. He documented the time, the location, the behavior, the escalation, and the search. He requested the incident report and the body cam footage through the proper process. He also made sure the recording he had didn't just live on a phone. It went to the places that knew how to apply pressure, oversight, internal review, and the right legal contacts. And once the complaint existed on paper, it became harder for the department to pretend it was just a misunderstanding, because now they had to answer very specific questions. Why were officers dispatched to a diner over someone sitting too long in the first place? What exactly was the suspicion? What law did Antonio break by sitting quietly? What justified the demand for identification? What justified detaining him when he stood to leave? What justified searching his pockets for ID? The department could have tried to bury it if it was only his word. But it wasn't. The diner had its own cameras. The officers had their own body cams, and Antonio's recording captured the tone shift, the threats, and the moment physical control replaced conversation. That's the part people miss about these encounters. The moment an officer decides to win is usually the moment the evidence starts piling up against them. In the short term, the story moved through the community fast, not as a rumor, more like a warning. Diners and barbershops and group chats lit up with the same pattern people had seen before. Someone minding their business, officers creating a problem, then acting like the person caused it by not submitting. But this time, there was a difference. There was clean documentation. As the complaint circulated through the right channels, supervisors had to review footage, compare statements, and line up the timeline. And once the facts were pinned down, the department couldn't credibly defend Keller's framing that Antonio was a community issue. It looked like what it was: an escalation built on discomfort, not law. The internal review didn't need dramatic conclusions. It just needed to be honest about procedure. The outcome hit weeks later, the way these things usually do, quietly, officially, with formal language that still carried a loud message. Both officers were fired. Not suspended, not retrained, not moved to a different shift. Fired. And when people asked why, the answer wasn't complicated. They had used vague complaints as a reason to harass. They had threatened consequences for refusing a demand. They had detained and searched to force identification. And they had done it in a public place, over a man calmly sitting in a booth. Antonio didn't celebrate in public. He didn't tour the internet for attention. He treated it the way he treated the whole encounter, like a matter of record. But the ripple mattered. The diner staff changed how they handled concern calls. The department adjusted guidance around non-criminal complaints and ID demands. Supervisors reminded officers that it felt suspicious, wasn't probable cause. And in that neighborhood diner, where comfort used to function like a gate, people learned that comfort doesn't outrank rights. Here's the part to sit with. Antonio didn't win because he got loud. He won because he stayed calm, refused to be baited, and demanded documentation like it was oxygen. So let me ask you, if you were sitting there and two officers tried to turn your presence into a problem, would you have stayed that composed? Or would their pressure have pulled you into the exact reaction they were hoping for? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've ever dealt with a situation like this, tell your story too. And don't forget to share this with someone who needs it. And subscribe for more story times where accountability shows up and dignity wins.
Random secondary, stepping aside.
What indicator triggered that, and what's the selection method for random?
Sir, you don't debate screening. Do what you're told.
I'm complying. I'm asking for your full name and your
I'm
ID
in
number.
charge here. Empty your pockets and stop recording.
All right, this is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Because on paper, this was a closed-door judicial conference, a room full of judges, a controlled venue, a standard security checkpoint. And yet a federal judge still got treated like a threat, purely off a random screening that got very unrandom the moment he asked basic questions. Holloway had stepped up to the checkpoint at the downtown convention center like everyone else. The scanner didn't beep. His bag didn't flag. He didn't argue with anyone, didn't act nervous, didn't do anything that looked even remotely suspicious. But a security officer still pulled him aside for secondary screening and labeled it random. Holloway didn't explode. He didn't posture. He did what people with real composure did when they sensed a game being played. He slowed everything down and made it official. He asked for full names and ID numbers, calmly, clearly. He confirmed the checkpoint cameras were recording. Then he pulled out his phone and started filming, not as a threat, but as documentation. That's when the officer and her supervisor got defensive. Not because he was being difficult, because he was turning their random moment into a record. Quick thing, tell me where you're watching from. City and state. And if you like stories where calm, documented accountability beats power trips, hit like and subscribe. Now here's how it really unfolded. The checkpoint itself looked routine. Stanchions, trays, scanners, uniformed staff moving people through fast. The kind of setup that trained everyone to keep walking and not ask questions. Holloway didn't give them a reason to stop him. Nothing on the equipment flagged, no alarms, no alert from the screen, no call out from another officer. Yet he was singled out anyway. The security officer told him he'd been selected for a random secondary screening. Holloway, still calm, asked what exactly had triggered it. What indicator, what policy, what selection method? The officer didn't answer with facts. She answered with attitude, and that was the first tell. The second tell was the supervisor. Instead of stepping in to clarify the process, the supervisor stepped in to back the officer's authority. He treated Holloway's questions like disrespect, like the act of asking was the problem. So Holloway made the interaction even more structured. He repeated his request for names and ID numbers. He noted the time. He glanced at the camera placement and verbally confirmed it was capturing audio and video. He kept his voice level while making sure the situation couldn't be summarized later as routine screening. Then they moved to the search. They pat-searched him anyway, even though nothing had flagged. They unzipped his briefcase and spread the contents out on the inspection table. They handled documents and electronics with the confidence of people who expected him to swallow it and move on. Holloway stayed composed and continued filming, and the deeper they dug, the more the tension changed. Because at some point, they hit a leather portfolio. Something about it, its formatting, markings, the seriousness of what it contained, made them slow down. Then the realization landed. He wasn't just some attendee. He was a judge. And it showed on their faces immediately. An instant flash of panic. The kind that happened when someone realized they'd been wrong in a way that could cost them. But instead of stopping, instead of correcting, instead of offering even a minimal apology, they doubled down. They kept searching like they needed to prove the search had been justified all along. Like backing off would be admitting the obvious, and then they crossed the line. They demanded Holloway power on his laptop. That wasn't a pat-down anymore. That wasn't secondary screening. That was access. Holloway didn't shout. He didn't make threats. He noted what was happening and kept his phone steady while an officer clicked through folders and opened sensitive court materials, documents that weren't supposed to be viewed at a public checkpoint by anyone without authority. And that became the moment the story stopped being about random screening and became about abuse of process. They dragged it out, found nothing, and finally let him go with a clipped non-explanation. No apology, no accountability, just a push to get him moving so the line could keep flowing. They acted like the problem would disappear if he walked away, but Holloway didn't walk away from it. He walked into the conference and then quietly started building a case. He collected witness contact information from people who had seen the interaction and heard key parts. He wrote down times, names, and what each staff member had said. He requested preservation of security footage and screening logs before anyone could lose them. He filed formal complaints through multiple channels, so there wouldn't be one gatekeeper who could bury it. And that was the mistake they didn't realize they'd made at the checkpoint. They didn't just stop a man. They stopped someone who understood systems, records, and consequences. Holloway didn't make a scene at the conference. He didn't walk in and announce what happened. He did something more effective. He treated the checkpoint incident like the first page of a file. Within hours, he had a clean timeline. When he arrived, when he was pulled aside, how long the search lasted, who touched what, who ordered what, and the exact moment the laptop was accessed. He had names and ID numbers. He had witness contacts from people who saw the search stretch past secondary screening into something else. And he had his own video showing tone, procedures, and the refusal to give a real explanation. Then he moved to preservation. He sent written requests to preserve checkpoint camera footage, screening logs, and any random selection records tied to that time block, before anyone could claim it had been overwritten or wasn't retained. He included dates, time ranges, and the exact checkpoint lane. He made it impossible to misunderstand what needed to be saved. And then he filed complaints through multiple channels on purpose. Not one complaint, several. Because he understood how these systems buried problems. One inbox, one supervisor, one internal review that ended in silence. So he split the path. Venue security leadership, the conference's administrative authority, the contracted security company, if applicable, and the federal oversight bodies that cared when sensitive court material was accessed by unauthorized personnel. That's when the resistance showed up. The first responses tried to shrink the story. They framed it as a routine screening. They leaned hard on the word random. They avoided addressing the laptop access directly. They offered vague reassurance instead of facts. Holloway didn't argue emotionally. He answered structurally. He pointed to what the equipment did and didn't do. He pointed to the length and depth of the search. He pointed to the escalation after he asked what triggered the screening. And he put the laptop issue in writing as the center of gravity. sensitive judicial materials had been opened at a checkpoint by someone with no authority to view them. That single point forced the matter out of customer service complaint territory and into security breach territory. Because now the question wasn't whether the staff had been rude. The question was who had accessed protected information and why. As soon as that was clear, the tone of the system changed. Not apologetic, cautious. Requests started coming back for his documentation. Someone asked for the witness contacts. Someone asked whether he still had the video. Someone asked whether he could identify which checkpoint camera was facing the inspection table. And behind the scenes, they did what institutions always did. When a complaint looked expensive, they started searching for patterns. That was the part nobody at the checkpoint expected. Because Holloway's case wasn't isolated. It was just documented cleanly enough that it couldn't be ignored. When the logs were pulled, random selection didn't look random anymore. It looked consistent in the worst way. Black professionals flagged at a noticeably higher rate than others, especially in the morning rush and just before high-profile sessions. Then the deeper problem surfaced, the complaint process itself. There were previous complaints, some formal, some informal, that had been resolved without real review. Some had been closed with boilerplate language. Some had never made it past the same small group of supervisors. A few were quietly categorized as misunderstandings and filed away without preserving footage. And once someone finally compared dates to staffing schedules, a second pattern appeared. The same officer squad combinations showed up again and again around the complaints. It wasn't just bias in the lane. It was protection behind the desk. At that point, outside scrutiny became inevitable. Either the organization invited it, or it was going to get forced on them. And Holloway kept pushing in the only way that matters. He insisted on written answers, preserved records, and independent review, because he knew that without oversight, the system would do what it always did. It would wait for the person to get tired. Holloway didn't get tired. Once the patterns started showing, the people in charge didn't respond with honesty first. They responded with containment. The security contractor and venue leadership did what institutions usually did when a complaint threatened to become a headline. They tried to frame it as one bad interaction, one misunderstanding, one random screening that simply looked unfortunate. But Holloway's documentation made that strategy impossible to hold. Because this wasn't just a complaint about being pulled aside. It was a complaint that included preservation requests, witness names, timestamps, and a clear allegation that sensitive court materials had been accessed at a checkpoint by personnel with no authority. That forced escalation. Internal reviewers were suddenly required to answer questions they normally avoided. Who ordered the laptop power on? Who touched the keyboard? What exactly was opened? Whether any data was copied, and whether the random selection method had any audit trail. And when those answers didn't come quickly or came back vague, Holloway did what experienced people did when they saw the stall tactic. He widened the circle again. He pushed it into independent oversight, channels that didn't report to the same managers who needed the problem to stay small. That meant outside investigators, compliance offices, and legal counsel. People who cared less about workplace harmony and more about liability, policy, and federal standards around information security. That's when the truth got sharper. The random selection process on paper was supposed to be neutral, either a true algorithmic pick or a simple interval system. But the logs and staffing practices didn't match a neutral process. The data showed clusters. The same staff were repeatedly making random choices, and the random outcomes weren't evenly distributed across demographic groups. In plain terms, it looked like discretion dressed up as math. Worse, the complaint pipeline had been designed to bury heat. Complaints were routed through the same limited chain, often closed without full footage review, and sometimes recorded in ways that made them hard to search later. It wasn't an accident. It was a safety valve, built to protect the organization, not the public. And once outsiders saw that, the issue stopped being, did staff treat one person unfairly? It became, Was there an ongoing pattern of discriminatory screening in a system that quietly hid it? That shift changed the tone overnight. Now, leadership wasn't just facing a civil rights problem. They were facing a governance problem. The review expanded. More footage windows were pulled. More screening logs were sampled. More complaints were reopened. People who had previously been ignored were contacted again. Black attorneys, consultants, executives, professionals who had described the same thing for years. Random selections that happened too often, followed by defensive staff the moment questions were asked. And once multiple accounts lined up with data, the organization ran out of room to pretend. The legal response moved fast after that. Holloway's case wasn't treated as a private disagreement. It became the anchor point for a major civil lawsuit because it wasn't just discrimination. It was the unlawful access of sensitive judicial materials conducted publicly, then followed by institutional stonewalling. The suit did what lawsuits often did when internal systems failed. It forced discovery. That's where organizations lose control. Because discovery demanded emails, training materials, policy drafts, internal complaint notes, staffing schedules, and the decision trail behind which footage was preserved and which wasn't. It pulled the curtain back on how random had been used as a shield. And with that pressure came consequences that weren't optional. Staff were terminated. Supervisors who had enabled the pattern were removed or reassigned. The security contractor faced contract penalties and public scrutiny. And once settlement talks started, it stopped being about saving face and became about limiting damage. The settlement was massive, multi-million-dollar territory, because the exposure was massive. Not only had discrimination been demonstrated, but the organization had allowed sensitive court materials to be accessed without lawful authority, then tried to minimize it. That combination was a legal and public relations nightmare. And importantly, the resolution didn't end with money. It came with reforms that could be measured, a redesigned random selection system with documented rules and audit logs, required supervisor sign-off for any extended secondary screening that went beyond a pat-down and bag check. After the settlement and the firings, the venue tried to sell the outcome as a clean reset. New policies, new training, new language about equity and professionalism. The kind of public-facing response organizations leaned on when they needed people to believe the problem had been fixed. But the people who'd been randomly selected for years didn't measure change by slogans. They measured it by what happened at the checkpoint. And the checkpoint did change because now it had oversight built into it. The random selection process was no longer something a screen could claim while a human quietly chose. It became auditable. Selections were logged automatically. Secondary screenings beyond a basic check required a documented reason and, in some cases, supervisor sign-off. Camera retention rules tightened. Complaints didn't disappear into the same internal loop. They went to an independent intake channel with timelines attached. The most important reform wasn't the policy text. It was the fact that the system now assumed someone would verify the system. That single expectation, someone checking, was what removed the old confidence staff had operated with. Because before Holloway, the worst consequence for a biased random selection was a complaint that could be buried. After Holloway, the consequence was evidence, data, footage, discovery. And people behaved differently when they knew the record would be real. For Holloway, the outcome wasn't framed as a victory lap. He didn't treat it like he'd won a personal battle. He treated it like he'd prevented future harm. He understood exactly what the checkpoint had been. A situation where staff felt entitled to expand their authority the moment someone didn't submit quietly. And he understood the deeper insult. They'd only panicked once they realized who he was. That was the whole story in a snapshot. Not just discrimination. Discretion plus ego, protected by a complaint system designed to absorb outrage and release nothing. So Holloway did what the system wasn't built for. He refused to let it absorb him. He turned the moment into a record, and the record into leverage. He kept it tight. Names, times, witnesses, preservation requests, multiple complaint channels. He made it impossible for one person to handle it quietly. Then, when the institution stalled, he forced the problem into a process it couldn't control, outside scrutiny and legal discovery. That was the real play, not anger, structure. And if you take anything from this story, it was this. Bias loved vague procedures. Accountability loved details. So here's the question for you. If you were in his position, would you have just moved on to avoid the stress? Or would you have done the work to make sure it didn't happen again to the next person? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever been singled out in a space where you did everything right, share what happened.
I need both of your IDs right now.
Are we being detained? What crime are you investigating?
A report came in. Just give me your IDs.
A report of what exactly? And what law says we have to identify without reasonable suspicion?
You're making this difficult. Don't play games.
We're not playing games. We're asking if this is consensual or
All right, this is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Officer Suarez stood over their table like the decision had already been made. He told the two black men he needed their IDs immediately because a waitress had reported they were planning a bank heist. He said it like it was normal, like it was a reasonable thing to accuse two customers of while they were eating. The men didn't raise their voices. They didn't get up. They didn't scramble to prove anything. They did the one thing Suarez clearly hadn't expected. They started asking whether they were being detained, what specific crime he suspected, and what law he believed gave him the right to demand identification. Suarez didn't answer cleanly. He repeated the waitress's report. He leaned on authority. He implied consequences. And as nearby diners started looking over, his posture shifted from checking on a call to winning a standoff. Right then, the whole moment stopped being about safety. It became about control. Quick thing, tell me where you're watching from. City and state. And if you like stories where people stay calm, know the rules, and force accountability when someone abuses power, hit like and subscribe. Now rewind. It started the way these things usually started. Someone got uncomfortable, gave their discomfort a dramatic name, and handed it to the police like a fact. A waitress saw two black men talking at a table and decided what she was hearing couldn't be normal conversation. Maybe she caught words like schedule, vault, or bank. Maybe she didn't even catch the words, just the vibe she assumed. Either way, the report that made it to Suarez wasn't two customers are being loud or two people are arguing. It was they're planning a bank heist. And Suarez treated that report like it gave him permission to turn a lunch into an interrogation. He walked in, went straight to their table, and opened with a demand instead of a question. Not a greeting, not a check-in. A demand for ID, right away, right in front of everyone. The two men held the line calmly. They didn't talk back the way people like to label it. They asked structured questions that forced Suarez to either justify himself or admit he couldn't. That's where the chess game began. Suarez tried the common moves. He framed it as an investigation, hoping the word itself would end the conversation. When that didn't work, he tried intimidation, suggesting he could make things inconvenient. Then he tried embarrassment, letting his voice carry, letting the room notice, making the men feel like refusing him would make them look guilty. But the men didn't give him the reaction he wanted. They stayed controlled and kept returning to the same points. Detention or not, crime or not, lawful basis or not. And because Suarez couldn't name an actual crime, he got stuck in the only place officers get stuck when they don't have facts. He started policing attitude. He warned them about tone. He implied they were being difficult. He suggested that refusing to comply was suspicious by itself. The manager drifted close, trying to smooth it over the way managers often did, by asking the targeted people to sacrifice their dignity so the room could stay comfortable. The men didn't take the bait. They didn't insult anyone. They made it clear that comfort wasn't a legal standard. By then, the whole restaurant felt it. This wasn't a quick check anymore. This was an officer trying to force compliance without the foundation to demand it. And just as Suarez edged toward escalation, just as it looked like he might try to create a reason to justify his presence, a third person stepped in. Not loud, not dramatic, just decisive. That person addressed Suarez directly and told him to step away from the table. Then, with the kind of calm that only came from real authority, they revealed what Suarez hadn't known when he walked in. The two men weren't random customers. They were undercover detectives. And Suarez's body language changed instantly, like someone had flipped a switch behind his eyes. He stopped posturing. He softened his voice. He began backing out of the moment he'd built, because now it wasn't just two black men refusing to be bullied. Now it was oversight, consequences, and a record that wouldn't be easy to rewrite. Suarez's whole posture changed the moment the third person identified the two men as undercover detectives. He stopped talking like he was in charge of the table. He started talking like he was trying to get out of a mistake. The third person, calm, clipped, clearly not there to debate, asked Suarez the same question the men had been asking the entire time. What specific articulable facts gave him reasonable suspicion that a crime was happening? Suarez didn't have anything new. He went back to the waitress report again, but now it sounded weaker, because the room had already watched him build an entire confrontation on it. That was the point the detectives didn't even have to say out loud. If the only thing that changed was Suarez learning who they were, then the issue wasn't safety. The issue was who he believed deserved automatic respect. Suarez tried to pivot into polite professionalism. He said he was just responding to a call. He implied it was routine. He tried to make it sound like he would have treated anyone the same, but his own behavior contradicted him in real time. Before the reveal, he had been firm, impatient, and ready to escalate over a refusal to identify. After the reveal, he got careful. His voice lowered, his hands stayed still. He started apologizing, and the detectives didn't reward it with friendliness. They didn't threaten him. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't perform for the restaurant. They held him to the standard he'd avoided: facts, not feelings. Through the narrator's lens, it was simple. The detectives kept their questions tight and gave Suarez no emotional material to twist into aggression. They kept the interaction on the record. They made sure the third person heard the full timeline. Suarez's demand, his inability to name a crime, his pressure tactics, his tone shift. That's also when the environment changed. You could feel diners recalibrating. The same people who were nervous a minute earlier now looked at Suarez differently. A couple of phones stayed up, not because the moment was dramatic, but because it was educational. This was what it looked like when authority got audited in public. Suarez's exit was quick. He backed away from the table, gave another short apology, and left the restaurant without IDs, without names, and without the compliance he'd tried to force. And because it ended quietly, some people would have wanted to call it no harm done. But the detectives didn't treat it like that. They treated it like evidence. Because they knew what had almost happened. A patrol officer had walked up to two black men eating lunch, accused them of plotting a serious felony based on a vague report, demanded identification without clear lawful basis, and escalated the interaction when they asked basic questions. And the only reason it stopped cleanly was that the men at the table were law enforcement too. That part mattered more than the apology. After the restaurant, the accountability chain started the way it always started, when someone smart refused to let the moment disappear. First came documentation. The third person who stepped in made sure the incident was noted immediately, who responded, what the initial call claimed, what was observed on scene, and what Suarez could or couldn't articulate. Dispatch logs existed. That bank heist call existed. If there was body camera footage, it existed too, and it captured the shift, demand, pressure, vague justification, and then the sudden politeness when status was revealed. Then came the complaint. The detectives didn't file it because they felt insulted. They filed it because they understood what the same encounter would look like for two regular black men with no backup, no chain of command walking in, and no reason for Suarez to suddenly become careful. They framed it the way complaints that stick are framed. Not emotion first, but policy first. Consensual encounter versus detention, reasonable suspicion, demanding identification, threatening consequences for refusing an unlawful demand. And most importantly, how the officer's tone and behavior changed only after learning who the men were. That last piece was hard to explain away, because it raised the questions supervisors hate having to answer. If the officer was willing to push this far on the public, what did he do in private when no one recorded him? Once the complaint hit the system, Suarez couldn't outrun the paper trail. The supervisors didn't need a dramatic investigation to understand the core problem. The call itself was already thin, planning a bank heist with no concrete details. Then the footage and logs showed what happened next. Suarez walked in, skipped straight to demanding IDs, and couldn't clearly explain a lawful basis when the men asked if they were being detained. That sequence mattered because it turned the situation from checking on a suspicious person call into detaining people based on a feeling. And the department had to treat that seriously, because this wasn't some hidden hallway moment. It happened in public, in a business with witnesses. In modern policing, public moments are never just public anymore. They're recorded, requested, reviewed, and compared. So the review centered on three things. 1. What dispatch actually received. They checked what the waitress said, how it was coded, and what details were included. A real heist report should have specific indicators, names, a weapon mention, maps, threats, casing behavior, anything. This call didn't. It was essentially a dramatic interpretation of two people talking. 2. What Suarez observed for himself. Supervisors looked for the part where Suarez could articulate, "I observed X, which led me to suspect Y." That part was missing. He relied on the report and then tried to force compliance when questioned. 3. How he escalated and why he de-escalated. This was the uncomfortable part for Suarez, the contrast. Before he knew who they were, he pressed. After he knew, he softened. Even if he never said anything outright, the shift told its own story. The department's response was realistic and procedural, not cinematic. Suarez was pulled in, questioned, and required to write his version of events. Then he was confronted with the reality that vague suspicion doesn't justify detention, and that refusing to provide ID isn't automatically a crime in most situations, unless specific conditions apply. His consequences were the kind that actually happen: a formal reprimand, mandatory training, and a note that stayed in his file. Depending on the agency and his history, it could include a short suspension or being placed under closer supervision for a period. But the detectives weren't satisfied with a quiet slap on the wrist that changed nothing. They pushed for a practical fix, a reminder to patrol officers about the difference between a consensual contact and a detention, and how suspicious person calls from businesses had to be screened for bias-based vagueness, not ignored, screened. Two black men talking couldn't be treated like actionable intel just because it was packaged with a scary phrase. The restaurant got its own fallout. Management couldn't pretend it was nothing once it became clear the accusation had been extreme. Even staff who wanted to defend the waitress had to face what she had actually set in motion: an armed officer confronting customers over an imagined felony in a room full of people without real evidence. The waitress didn't become a cartoon villain in the aftermath. She became what these situations usually reveal: a person who felt fear or suspicion, labeled it danger, and expected the system to handle it without questioning her assumptions. That's why the detectives treated this as bigger than Suarez. Because Suarez didn't invent the suspicion alone. He inherited it, accepted it, and escalated it. And the most important part, the part that stuck with people who witnessed it, was how simple the difference was. Nothing about the detective's behavior changed after the reveal. Only Suarez changed. That became the lesson, the quiet proof, the thing you couldn't unsee once you saw it. After Suarez left the restaurant, the moment didn't feel over for the two detectives. It felt exposed, because what happened wasn't complicated. Two black men sat down to eat. A staff member attached a violent story to them with no real facts. A patrol officer treated that story as enough to demand compliance. And when the men stayed calm and asked basic legal questions, the officer tried to turn the encounter into a power contest. Then one detail changed. Someone revealed the men had status inside the system. And suddenly, the same officer who couldn't explain a lawful basis found his manners. That contrast became the lasting evidence, not just for the detectives, but for everyone who witnessed it. In the weeks that followed, the case didn't become a viral spectacle in this version of reality. It became something quieter, which is often how real change happens: paperwork, meetings, and uncomfortable conversations, where people have to stop hiding behind vague phrases. Suarez's supervisors reviewed the incident as a liability problem and a policy problem. They didn't have to guess what happened. Dispatch logs and footage captured the entire arc. The initial accusation, the demand for IDs, the repeated refusal to clarify detention, and the tone flip after the undercover reveal. That made it hard to rewrite. So the department responded in layers. First layer, corrective action for Suarez. He was required to account for his decision-making. He was reminded formally that vague suspicion from a third party didn't automatically equal legal grounds to detain. He received documented discipline and retraining focused on consensual encounters, reasonable suspicion, and escalation control. And whether the punishment was mild or serious, the key thing happened. It became part of his record. Not a rumor, a file. Second layer, guidance to prevent repeats. The detectives pushed for a procedural reminder that business calls needed to be handled with clearer thresholds. Not ignored, just not blindly accepted. If the suspicion was essentially a vibe dressed up as danger, officers needed to slow down and verify before turning customers into suspects. It wasn't a grand reform. It was a guardrail. And guardrails matter. The restaurant had its own reckoning. Managers hate admitting the truth in these situations. Staff can turn bias into a police response with one phone call. And once it's done, the targeted person carries the risk, not the caller. So management reviewed the decision chain, what the waitress actually reported, what she claimed she heard, whether anyone tried to ask questions before dialing 911. They updated training, clarified guidelines, and made it clear that "they look suspicious" wasn't a reason to involve law enforcement. The waitress faced consequences that fit real workplaces, coaching, discipline, and a new understanding that her assumptions could have gotten someone hurt. She may not have intended harm, but intent didn't erase impact. And after that, the restaurant's staff had to live with the uncomfortable reality. Their dining room had been the stage for a double standard. For the detectives, the outcome wasn't satisfaction, it was clarity. They'd handled the confrontation the way they'd been trained to handle dangerous uncertainty. Stay calm, stay structured, don't give the other side emotional fuel, and keep forcing the interaction back to objective rules. But privately, they couldn't ignore the part that haunted the whole thing. If they weren't detectives, if they were just two regular black men with normal jobs, Suarez might have pushed it further. He might have demanded they stand, might have searched them, might have decided non-compliance was the crime. And later, he might have written it up in a way that sounded clean. That's why they filed the complaint anyway. Because the real issue wasn't that a cop bothered two detectives. It was that the system only relaxed once it realized the men at the table belonged to it. And that's the moral that sticks. Power will test your boundaries when it thinks you don't know the rules. And the simplest form of protection, sometimes the only safe one, is calm, documented accountability. So here's the question for you. If you were sitting at that table, would you have known how to respond without escalating it? Would you have felt safe enough to keep asking, am I being detained? What crime? What suspicion? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've ever had someone try to turn a feeling into authority over you, share your story too. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real, grounded story times like this. Because the next person at that table might not have anyone walk in to change the tone,